Ever get the feeling that some kids learn language, well, kind of differently? Like instead of picking up words one by one, it's like they download a whole movie at once.
That's a great way to put it. We're talking about gestalt language processing. It's often shortened to GLP. And yeah, it can seem like these kids are thinking about language in this really big picture kind of way.
And this is something that comes up a lot with autistic children, right?
Exactly. It's a way of experiencing language that's often overlooked and unfortunately can lead to a lot of misunderstandings, especially when it comes to things like, well, speech therapy, for example.
Which is what we're diving into today. We're really lucky to be looking at this through the work of Dr. Jamie Horrocks. They've written extensively on this, and what makes their perspective so interesting is that they actually identify as a Gestalt language processor themselves.
Yeah, their insights are really valuable. I mean, they really get what it's like to experience the world in this way. And they've been very vocal about how traditional approaches to language therapy just don't work for GLPs. In fact, they often make things worse. Well,
Because
because traditional therapy tends to break language down into these tiny pieces, like individual words and grammar rules. But for GLPs, language isn't about these isolated bits. It's all about context, emotion, the whole sensory experience.
So, like, if a child learns the phrase, I want to go outside, it's not just that they've memorized those four words in isolation. They've learned it because they were feeling cooped up inside, maybe looking out the window longingly, and that whole feeling gets bundled up with those words.
Exactly. It's like that phrase becomes a container for that entire experience. So when they say, I want to go outside, it's not just a random string of words. It's like they're reliving that whole sensory experience.
Wow, that's really powerful. But then if you have a therapist who's coming in and trying to dissect the grammar of I want to go outside, like let's conjugate the verb to want, it's almost like they're missing the point entirely.
Exactly. It's like trying to explain the plot of a movie by analyzing the chemical composition of the film strip. You're just not getting at the heart of the experience. And that's where this idea of executive function comes in, which is, a whole other layer to this.
Yeah, executive function, that's a big one. Could you explain a little bit more about how that plays into all of this, especially for GLPs?
Absolutely. You see, executive function isn't just about things like planning and organization. It's also about how we generalize information and apply it in new situations. And for GLPs, who often learn language in these big, holistic chunks, executive function is crucial for being able to break down those chunks and use them flexibly.
So it's like they have this vast library of these language movies stored away, but they might need some extra help figuring out which movie to play at what time and how to maybe edit it on the fly to fit the situation.
That's a great analogy. And that's why it's so important for therapists, educators, anyone working with these kids to really understand how executive function and GLP are interconnected.
And that actually will leads us to something else that Dr. Horrocks talks about that's often misunderstood, and that's echolalia.
Yeah, echolalia. You know that thing where kids repeat phrases or sounds,
Yeah.
especially like on the autism spectrum, it's often seen as this thing that needs to be, fixed.
But Dr. Horrocks has a very different take, right?
Oh yeah, totally different. They see it as, well, not just meaningless repetition, but as a tool, like a really important tool that these kids are using to, make sense of the world and to communicate.
Which makes sense given everything we've been talking about, right? Its
Yeah.
language is so tied to this like whole body experience for them, then repeating those phrases might be a way for them to like process or integrate those experiences.
Exactly. And it's like, imagine if someone told you that the way you learn best is like wrong or that you need to stop doing it. How would that make you feel?
Yeah, not great. It reminds me of I don't know, like if someone told you you were dancing off beat, but you were actually just moving to a different rhythm, one that they couldn't quite hear.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
And that's like the heart of what Dr. Hurix is advocating for, which is this move towards what they call neurodivergent affirming therapy. Instead of trying to fit these square pegs into round holes, we need to create space for them to thrive as they are, you know.
So what does that look like, practically speaking? What are some of the strategies or approaches that align with that philosophy?
Well, for one, instead of viewing echolalia as something to be extinguished, we can actually use it as a springboard for learning. Like Dr. Horrocks talks about this technique where therapists encourage the child to use those repeated phrases in new context. So let's say a child always says, I want to go outside. A therapist might create opportunities for them to use that phrase in different situations, like, I want to go to the park, or I want to go to grandma's house.
Oh, so sometimes it's like you're not trying to eliminate the echolalia, you're trying to build on it to help them expand their repertoire of language within that framework that makes sense to them.
Right? And another big one that Dr. Horrocks talks about is the power of storytelling, GLPs. They thrive on context, on sensory richness. And what better way to provide that than through stories?
Instead of like drilling grammar rules in isolation, you're weaving those rules into an engaging narrative that like brings them to life, right?
Exactly. It's about making language come alive, making it relevant to their lived experiences.
It really makes you think about like how we define good communication,
Yeah.
because if we're only valuing one particular way of using language, are we missing out on all these other forms of expression?
Absolutely. And, it's one thing to like say we value those other ways, but it's another thing entirely to actually listen and try to understand where someone's coming from, especially if it's different from how we experience the world ourselves.
With GLPs, it seems like a big part of that is, well, like we were saying before, remembering that language isn't just about the words themselves, it's about all the stuff that's packed into those words, the emotions, the memories, the sensory stuff.
Right, exactly. And what's interesting is that Dr. Hurwitz actually points out that, this whole understanding of Gestalt language processing, it's not even really new. Like, they cite research going back to the 80s that was already looking at echolalia and how it functions for autistic kids.
So it's like we've had some of these puzzle pieces for a while, but maybe we haven't always known how to put them together or like seen the bigger picture they were forming.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what's so important about, having these conversations, these deep dives into these topics. It helps us see things with fresh eyes, maybe challenge some of our assumptions.
And hopefully start to bridge that gap between like the research that's out there and what's actually happening in homes, in schools, in therapy rooms.
Because ultimately, it's about giving these kids the tools they need
Yeah.
to navigate the world in a way that feels authentic to them, right?
Absolutely. Well, I feel like we've covered a ton today about Gestalt language processing, and I think it's something that even for folks who maybe haven't heard that term before, it really makes you think differently about language and communication in general, doesn't it?
It really does. It kind of opens up this whole other dimension of how we think about, like, neurodiversity and how we support kids who learn and process information differently.
And maybe even how we can all learn to be more open and curious and just better communicators in general, right?
Couldn't agree more. It's
Yeah.
all about embracing those differences.
Well, on that note, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.